So we are honoured to have Jerry Wierwille here for the second time, all the way from the States. He is the Director of Research at Spirit and Truth. He is the President-elect at Spirit and Truth. He is also a pastor at Living Hope International Ministries. And as I said, I have enjoyed many of his sermons. He's spearheading Converge next week. And as I said, it's going to be a Unitarian packed summer. He's got a beautiful wife and two beautiful girls and a pug called Dexter. And he will be presenting Your Throne, O God, the Christological significance of Psalm 45, 6-7 in Hebrews 1, 8-9. Give him a big hand.
Thanks, Daisy, for that introduction. I'm happy to be here. Thanks to the UCA board and UK committee for this opportunity to speak to you today about this topic, particularly with regard to one phrase in Hebrews 1:8, which is traditionally translated as, Your throne, O God. So I want to answer two questions, really. The first is, does Hebrews 1:8 refer to Jesus as God? And then secondly, what is the Christological significance of the quotation, which we'll look at, from Psalm 45 in Hebrews chapter 1, verses 8 and 9? Now, Hebrews chapter 1, there's a long series of quotations that happen, and it's often called a katina, where it's a repetitive or like a sequence of Old Testament quotations. I like to read that together to kind of situate verses 8 and 9 within that matrix. So beginning in verse 4, Hebrews chapter 1 says, After he, referring to Jesus, had accomplished the cleansing for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high, having become as much better than the angels as the name he has inherited is more excellent than theirs. For to which of the angels did he, God, say at any time, You are my son, today I have become your father. And again, I will be his father, and he will be my son. And when he again brings the firstborn into the inhabited world, he says, And let all the angels of God bow down before him. And with respect to the angels, it says, Who makes his angels as winds and his ministers as a flaming fire. But to the Son, it says, Your throne, O God, is forever and ever, and the scepter of uprightness is the scepter of your kingdom. You have loved righteousness and hated lawlessness. Therefore, God, your God, has anointed you with the oil of gladness rather than your companions. And you, Lord, in the beginning laid the foundation of the earth, and the heavens are the works of your hands. They will perish, but you continue on, and they will all grow old like a garment, and you will roll them up like clothing, and they will be changed like a garment. But you are the same, and your years will not fail. But to which of the angels has he said at any time, Sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet? This series of Old Testament quotations can be structured in like an alternating fashion, where something is being addressed or described about angels, and then a contrast is being made with the Son, Jesus. And our quotation falls into the fifth one of this list. And it comes from Psalm chapter 45, verses 6 and 7. And this is quoted in verses 8 and 9 in Hebrews 1, where, but of the Son it says, Your throne, hatheos. I'm just going to throw the Greek word in there because we're going to talk about how to translate that. Your throne, hatheos, forever and ever. And the scepter of uprightness is the scepter of your kingdom. You have loved righteousness and hated lawlessness. Therefore, God, your God, has anointed you with the oil of gladness rather than your companions. The author of Hebrews, quoting from Psalm 45, actually uses the Septuagintal version of this reading. And there's very little difference between the reading in the Greek from Hebrews chapter 1, verses 8 and 9, and Psalm 45 in the Septuagint, which is actually Psalm 44, verse 7. And the difference is some articles are switched, the conjunction is added, but essentially the meaning is replicated from the Septuagint in the author's rendering. Now the Septuagint is a translation of the Hebrew Old Testament. So the next question could then ask is, well, is there any distinction between the Hebrew and then the Greek of the Septuagint that the author of Hebrews is drawing upon? And essentially, there's not. Essentially, the Greek of the Septuagint faithfully represents the Hebrew meaning. And in the translation from the Hebrew to the Greek, we're talking about in Hebrews chapter 1, this word theos, which is the Greek word for God. In the Hebrew, this translates the word Elohim. These are the words of interest. And we're going to discuss kind of, well, what could Elohim mean? And can that inform anything about the way that theos is being used, perhaps? But before we get to that, we need some context about Psalm 45, where this quotation is coming from. Psalm 45 is part of a collection of psalms called royal psalms that deal with different things like coronations or weddings for the king and royalty. Psalm 45 is a wedding psalm describing the king and his bride. And it can be structured like this in sort of a ABC, BCA type of fashion. And verse 6 and 7 fall under a description of the bridegroom, talking about his glory. So some context from the translation of the Septuagint, the LES. It reads, "Your throne, ha-theos, for eternity of eternity. The rod of your kingdom is a rod of uprightness. You loved righteousness and hated lawlessness. On account of this, God, your God, anointed you with the olive oil of great joy beyond your companions. Myrrh and oil of myrrh and cassia are from your garments, and bastions of ivory from which they made you cheerful. Daughters of kings are in your honor. The queen is near at your side, clothed in apparel, interwoven with gold, adorned with embroidery." This section of Psalm 45 is talking about the king and some of the attributes and sort of like giving him sort of like this praiseworthy description. So between the Hebrew Old Testament and the translation of the Septuagint, let's focus in on, can we learn anything about the way that the Hebrew, the word Elohim is used, that could maybe inform us on how the word theos is used in the Septuagint, and then thus how the author of Hebrews might be using it in chapter 1. The main question revolves around whether or not Elohim and also theos, as we'll get to, whether it should be taken as a vocative or a nominative. There is grammatical ambiguity between the two. But as I would like to share, I think that there is reasons for both, but one side I think has better reasons than the other. Now, for those of you who are not grammarians or don't maybe understand exactly what the dilemma is here between these choices, a vocative essentially is a direct address. For example, if you say, "Lord, where will we go?" Lord is a vocative. You are speaking to someone called Lord. Or if you say, "Who, brothers and sisters, told you this?" It's a direct address. You're speaking to some audience of brothers and sisters. On the other hand, a nominative, which could be a subject nominative or a predicate nominative. For example, "You are the Christ." A predicate nominative, the Christ, is identified here as who you are. And then, "My God is Yahweh." Now, the "my God" would be a subject nominative, and Yahweh would be a predicate nominative. And some type of identity or some type of relationship is construed in the nominative form, whereas in a vocative, it indicates direct address. So, Elohim as a vocative, what are the reasons that would be seen to be preferred as a vocative over a nominative? First, the anarthrous form of Elohim is typical of vocatives in the Hebrew Scriptures. There are two other vocatives in Psalm 45 that are anarthrous as well. Now, on the downside, like a criticism, is if Elohim is a vocative, a direct address, this actually is probably the only place in the Hebrew Old Testament where this occurs, where there is a direct address of Elohim to a non-divine being. Non-divine meaning a human agent. Well, if it is vocative, and the king here who's in view in Psalm 45 is being called Elohim, what way would that be permissible? Why would he be called Elohim? A helpful explanation could be that he, the king, was Yahweh's anointed. Kings were called the anointed ones of God, the Israelite kings. And in the sense that he served as God's deputy on earth, exercising a delegated yet sovereign authority. And as anointed leader of God's chosen people, the king was, by the gracious divine will, called God's adopted son. Yet in accounting for this unique application of the title Elohim to a king, we must reckon with more than simply the king's divine election and his unique role in standing in loco Dei, like in the place of God. The king may exceptionally be addressed as God also because, endowed with the spirit of Yahweh, he exhibits certain divine characteristics. In Psalm 45, glory and majesty are ascribed to him, as they are to God. He is a defender and lover of truth and right, or what is right, just as God is. He judges with equity, as God does. Just as God's rule is eternal, so is the dynasty to which the Davidic king belongs. So this is what it would mean for the king of Israel to be called Elohim, or to be called God. Not in a direct sense of identity, but in some type of relationality to Yahweh or to God. And therefore, he can be described as being God or functioning in a capacity that represents God. Now, on the other hand, if Elohim is taken to be a nominative, there are two other vocatives in Psalm 45 that evenly divide out the different sections. There's a part about the bridegroom, and there's a part about the bride. Each one begins with a vocative. And if you remove the one from verse 6, then you have two vocatives that divide the psalm equally into the two addresses to the independent and respective people. For example, in verse 3, strap your sword on your thigh, O mighty one, in your splendor and your majesty. This is the beginning of the address to the bridegroom, which is the king. And then in verse 10, it switches to, listen, O daughter, which is a reference to the queen here, or the bride, and consider and turn your ear, and forget your own people, and also your father's house. It would nicely structure the psalm to have these two vocatives make the transition between the two addressees, and not be interrupted by this third mysterious one interjected into the bridegroom section. A criticism is that as a nominative, this kind of creates an unwarranted or an awkward syntax change between the two parts of verse 7. What this looks like is, in verse 7, so I'm going to be talking about like the Hebrew versus the Greek versus the English, and they all have different numberings. So I apologize if it gets confusing. But essentially, you have the beginning here. Your throne is, and then it can't be is God in a direct sense because we know the king is not actually Elohim himself. So there has to be some other relationality, some type of simile or metaphor being used here. So you have to say that the throne resembles or is like God in some way, is like Elohim in some way. But then the second part, a scepter is the scepter of your kingdom. We have what's called the simple predicate of identity, where the scepter of the king is being described or is being identified as a certain type of scepter. It's a scepter of his kingdom. So you get this kind of change in syntax if you make it a nominative, because it can't be a simple predicate nominative. Otherwise, you have a theological conundrum. So, for example, if the throne is described as Elohim, it could be, the relationship could be, your throne is like the throne of God. And what this would mean is it's maybe righteous, or it's just, or strong, or authoritative, or some other kind of like attribute. If it is your throne is established by God, if that's the relationship, then it could be it comes from God, is protected or sustained by God. Or if you just say your throne is like God, you take some divine attribute and then attribute it to the throne. So the throne is divine, or the throne is eternal, or the throne is spiritual, or something like that. Now, a lot of times people ask the question, and they have a reluctance to see the vocative use because they wonder, can Elohim actually be used of non-divine beings? Are there any occurrences where we can see the word Elohim being attributed to a human individual. And I'd like to set before you just a couple cases from the Old Testament where this occurs. The first one can be seen in Exodus chapter 7. Now here, after God calls Moses to go and intercede and to deliver his people Israel from the oppression that is happening in Egypt, he says that he has made you, he's speaking to Moses, I have made you Elohim to Pharaoh. Well, to look at some other, how do other ancient versions look at this reference? And we're going to do this with each one of these accounts. Well, the Septuagint renders it as, I have given you as God to Pharaoh, using a double accusative form, typically as something is the way to render that. Ancient Greek translations, Aquila and Symmachus, they read the same as the Septuagint. Vulgate reads, I have made or appointed you God. And then the Aramaic translation of the Old Testament from the Babylonian Targum, Onkelos, says, I have established you as master, rendering the Hebrew word Elohim as Rav, master. The next one is in Exodus 21. Exodus 21. This circumstance here in this passage is about the service of a slave. If a slave serves a master for 6 years, and that service ends, the servant can then have the opportunity to declare whether or not they want to continue serving the master and become a lifelong servant in that household. And if so, then the text says that that master is to bring his servant to God. The Septuagint renders this as that the master is to bring the servant to the judgment seat or judgment place, the kriterion, the judgment place of God. Aquila and Symmachus read just simply to the gods, very literal, along with the Vulgate. And then the Onkelos says to or before, and then it renders Elohim as Diniyah, the judges. It understands that Elohim is not Almighty Elohim, but they understand this to be, well, this is the Elohim of Israel. These are the judges of Israel. Lastly, Exodus 22, verses 8 and 9. So unlike in Exodus 21 that we just looked at, the circumstance here is about a dispute of somehow missing property, an allegation of theft, and where the thief is not found. In this instance, the owner of the house where the property was and has gone missing is supposed to be brought to and must come before Elohim, must come before God. The Septuagint says that they need to be brought before or in the presence of God, or, and we don't have a text here from the Greek translations of Aquila and Symmachus, but Vulgate says to the gods, and again, Onkelos, to the judges. So the judges, along with the priests, they were empowered representatives of Yahweh who were to carry out Yahweh's justice among the people on behalf of Yahweh. And this is the context here in verse 8. It's a sort of a juridical procedure with Elohim referring to a judge of Israel that the case can be brought before, and they can then judge or determine the guilt or the innocence of the parties involved. And then after hearing the claims of the parties, the Elohim is supposed to either condemn or declare the guilty or innocence of the parties. And if guilty, then the person who is responsible for the property is supposed to repay double. So after the verdict is pronounced and the hearing of an oath by the homeowner, the Elohim of Israel that as judges seems to be the only interpretation that fits the context and best explains these circumstances that are involved. So I think through just these couple little examples, you could probably add 1 Samuel 2:25 to this list as well, but these show clearly, and I think at least in Exodus maybe 22, 8 and 9, unambiguously, Elohim can be used of non-divine beings. So if that's what Elohim can be used, can theos also carry a similar meaning? And so that's why we return then now to Hebrews chapter 1, verse 8, where we have a use of theos. And we're going to need to take into account the way that Elohim is used in the Hebrew text and then on into the Septuagint, of which the author draws. So in Hebrews 1:8, when the author quotes Psalm 45, 6, and 7, is it supposed to be nominative or vocative? And there's some additional considerations, I think, that we have to look at. First, if we take theos in Hebrews 1:8 as a nominative, which would be something like, your throne is God, or God is your throne. Well, this would remove theological tension, because there would be no issue as to how theos is being used in reference to the Son, as it would not be. It would be referring to Yahweh, the Almighty God. And it would alleviate some of the Christological controversy. Now, while there is another instance in the Old Testament from Psalm 82, 6, which some of you might be familiar with, as Jesus quotes this in John chapter 10, I believe. And he says, you are gods. That could be a reference to Israel, could be a reference to angelic beings there. But it is clearly a predicate nominative in that case. And so if theos is viewed as a nominative, then the tension around how it's being used with regard to the Son kind of dissipates. Another sort of advantage scholars often levy is that, well, the preposition pros, which is used in verses 7 and then in 8, that it would be able to carry a similar sense rather than change senses or change meanings. This would look like this in verses 8 and 9. And with respect to the angels, it says, who makes his angels as winds and his ministers as a flaming fire. But with respect to the Son, it says, your throne is God forever and ever, and the scepter of uprightness is the scepter of your kingdom, and so on. It seems like, well, if you have the nominative, then you can have a similar use of the preposition. But this kind of falls apart, though, as you take the elliptical meaning in verses 10, where there's another citation that's paired with verses 8 and 9, and the preposition is supposed to be distributive, where you have and then the ellipsis, with respect to the Son, it says, you, Lord, in the beginning laid the foundation. And this doesn't really work, because we actually have the explicit vocative form in verse 10. And so if it's a matter of, well, if it's nominative, then we can have the meaning of the preposition pros be the same as in verse 7. Well, when you get down to verse 10, it is a vocative, and the meaning of pros does not carry to it. So I think it's problematized by that fact. Another reason why theos could be nominative in Hebrews 1:8 is that there is a structural parallelism then formed between the first part, A, and the second part, B. This looks like this. You have your throne, you have an object, and then you have is, and then some type of a predicate, God forever and ever. And then the second half is the scepter is, and then you have the predicate, the scepter of your kingdom. You have this really nice, clean parallelism between the first and second half of the verses. This is a feature of Hebrew poetry where things are often repeated in a similar structure within Hebrew poetry, which Psalms is. And then lastly, here on the advantages, it removes the multi-theos kind of distinction where you'd have to understand theos having more than one meaning within these two verses. And what I'm referring to is in 8 and 9, we actually have 3 occurrences of the word theos, but there is one unambiguous case, and that's the second use in verse 9, where we know that theos is not the same as the theos of verse 8, because there's a possessive pronoun that shows a distinction. The theos of verse 8, if it is nominative, then you can say all these theoses then have the same reference. They're all referring to Yahweh. But if you have verse 8 as a vocative referring to the Son, then in verse 9, when it is God, your God, has echisen, anointed you, then that can't be the same God as the one referred to in verse 8. More on that to come. And so if it is a nominative, then you don't have to have this sort of, well, what's the use of theos in verse 8, and then what's the different use of theos in verse 9? A drawback is that in both the vocative and the nominative forms, they're a unique expression. There's no other place that I know of in Scripture that has a relation of equivalence or of identity with God and a throne. There are certain texts that talk about God giving a throne or God establishing a throne, but never God being a throne. And so this is a unique meaning or unique expression, either in the nominative and the vocative. So you'll see this reason in both lists. Lastly, probably the largest drawback to the nominative form is that it requires some sort of elliptical interpretation. As we looked at before, it's not straightforward. It's not a simple predicate. God is not actually a throne. There's some type of metaphorical relationship between the two. And this is the way that metaphors work with God in the scriptures. For example, like if you say, God is your rock. Well, what it is in a metaphorical way that a rock is strong, a rock is immovable, a rock is firm, so is God. It doesn't work really the same way in the sense of like your throne is God or God is your throne. Because it's not clear like in what way, as you know, if God is divine or he's eternal or he's just or all powerful, well, so that is your throne as well? It's not clear that that is the attribution being intended. So it requires some type of elliptical interpretation to get sensible meaning out of the nominative. Now, if theos is a vocative, well, this is the conventional use of the nominative. The nominative in both Hebrews, the New Testament, the Septuagint, especially the Psalms, the way that the vocative appears is in the form of a nominative. I found a number of references where this occurs in Psalms, and actually I didn't find a single occurrence of the actual vocative form, which is thea. This is the vocative form of theos. It doesn't appear in Psalms and appears extremely rarely in the Septuagint and in the New Testament. However, in the book of Hebrews, we have just a few chapters later, in chapter 10, another instance of the nominative form as a vocative. This is in Hebrews chapter 10, verse 7, which is a quote from Psalm 40, verse 8, where it says, "Then I said, in the scroll of the book, it is written about me, look, I have come to do your will, O God." And we have just the simple form of the nominative here, but clearly it can't be some type of predicate or subject nominative. It has to be a vocative, in which case it is. So this is a normal use of the nominative is for the vocative. So I kind of just dispelling some of the criticisms about, well, why wouldn't the author just use the vocative form if he meant it? Well, it's because that wasn't the convention. They didn't use the vocative very often. It was falling out of use. Secondly, it's grammatically expected. When you have a number of second-person pronouns, you, and you, and your, and you come to then expect some type of maybe a direct address, identifying who the you and your are. So it's grammatically consistent to say, well, if you have this second-person kind of like program going on here, that it would be completely within the pattern to see a vocative form, identifying who that you or your is. The parallel syntaxes between verses 8 and 10. So while there's parallel syntax is that an argument for the nominative within verse 8, parts A and B, there's an argument for the vocative between 8 and 10, which are two different citations. And we know in verse 10, the vocative form actually appears. Kuria. So we have, O Lord, or the address Lord in verse 10. And if we had the vocative in verse 8, your throne, O God, then these two different citations that have the second person pronouns and would be having a direct address, and they would be consistent, or they'd be in agreement with each other. And that would then form a nice little contrast with what God has said about the angels in verse 7. And lastly, and probably maybe the most significant, is that the cantillation that we see in the Hebrew text of Psalm 45 in verse 6 suggests that the word Elohim should be understood as vocative. Thus, relating to the word theos should also then carry that. Now, when I'm talking about the cantillation here, here's a page of the Codex Leningrad from early 11th century. And if we zoom in on the section of Psalm 45, verse 6, where we have Kisaka, Elohim here, we have this little tiny little squiggle mark. This is called a disjunctive accent, a zakef katan. It's a way that the the Masoretes, they would mark the verses in a little bit of a symmetrical way to try to separate them out into spacings or where pauses should occur. And so to make it a little bit cleaner for everybody here, this is what we're talking about. This little tiny mark here at the beginning of Elohim. And what this suggests in Hebrew is that there should be separation between the end of the kisaka, which is your throne, and then the word Elohim, God. If it was supposed to be viewed as a predicate, this is not normal. You would not put this disjunctive accent in between those two. A drawback, perhaps, to the vocative is that this would potentially be a unique address. Now, granted, there is another one in John chapter 20, verse 28. There's another direct address using theos that potentially relates to Jesus. If you count that one, then there are two. Otherwise, if that one is seen differently, then this would be the only one. So, needless to say, this is an extreme rarity. So it would be a unique use, essentially. And if you use a vocative, then you now have to explain why there are two different uses of the word theos within one verse of each other. There's a double meaning in verses 8 and 9. But let's look at that for a second, this double meaning, because I think this becomes problematic for viewing it from a kind of a deity of Christ or a Trinitarian perspective. In verse 9, we have, you have loved righteousness and hated lawlessness. Therefore, God, your God, the ha-theos, ha-theosu, he has anointed you with the oil of gladness rather than your companions. Now, it is possible the first theos here can also be viewed as a vocative as well. But I think it's more likely to be viewed here as a subject nominative and then the ha-theosu as an appositive, which is modifying which theos that is. To me, that's a more natural way to see the syntax and grammar here. But the real issue is, who is this ha-theosu? Who's this your God? Because when you have a possessive pronoun, it is showing some type of distinction from yourself. If it's your friend, then that friend is not you. You have someone who is called your friend or who you view as your friend. Therefore, this second use of ha-theos in verse 9 seems to suggest there is a different use of theos being used here in the text. Now, how do Trinitarians get around this? Well, one way is that, and this is representative by R.C.H. Lenski, he says, we've already stated that the human nature of the Son is in the mind of the writer from verse 2 onward. And for this human nature, God was the God of Christ, our King, and will ever remain so. Those who have an unclear understanding of the union of the two natures of Christ will always offer hesitating or inadequate or even wrong comment. What he's essentially saying is that if you don't understand the hypostatic union of the two natures in Christ, then you can't understand what the author of Hebrews is doing here by saying, well, there's a God in verse 8 and there's a God in verse 9, and they are ontologically the same, but with respect to Christ's human nature, he can be said to have a God who is the Father. And so this is the way that they show the distinctive meaning between theos in verse 8 while trying to retain its literal meaning where where Jesus the Son is being called the Almighty God, the God from back in verse 1 in Hebrews, the one who spoke in times of old through the prophets, but has spoken recently through a son. That creator God, they say, is the same God in verse 8 as the Son, ontologically, meaning in his being. But then in verse 9, when it comes to the one that has anointed him above or rather than his companions, well, that God is his God according to his human nature. And therefore, he can function, it can be the God the Father doing this to God the Son. That's their explanation. That's how they get around this sort of like issue with the dual meaning. But I'd like to offer, I think what I'd say is a more plausible way to understand the distinction, if it's a vocative, between verses 8 and 9. And this thing gets on to our second question here is, what is the Christological significance of Psalm 45 in Hebrews 1, 8, and 9. Most interpreters are preoccupied so much with the question that the Son is called theos and make sort of a mountain out of a little detail, more so than I think it actually conveys. But I don't think the question whether or not a nominative or a vocative make all the difference in the meaning, or you could say the Christological significance of the psalm quotation. Even if the vocative is viewed as the better way to understand the grammar, in which I do believe so, and I think I've given some pretty good reasons why, the purpose for the quotation of Psalm 45 does not derive from the use of that term either semantically, grammatically, syntactically. The quotation of Psalm 45 is relevant precisely because of the way it shows the contrast with the angels from verse 7. Verse 7 describes angels as those who serve in the divine administration of the cosmos and whose service is in following the commands of God. But in such a service, it is transitory. It is subject to change. The quotation from Psalm 104:4 that appears in verse 7 of Hebrews 1 is probably best read as, who makes his angels as winds, his ministers as a flaming fire. This probably refers to the way that God's angels execute his will swiftly, like a wind, and with great strength, which is there as flaming fire. They have power. The main point of the text of Psalm 104 is to emphasize the mutability and the ephemerality of angels. As high and as great of the service as they are to the divine administration of the universe, they are still and only messengers and ministers or servants. But this is not the case with the Son, Jesus. Verse 8 then delivers this contrasting station of the Son against that of the angels. The Son is not a servant, rather a king. And whereas the angels are commissioned to be laborers in executing the divine will, the Son is not counted among the working class of his kingdom. Instead, he is set up over top of it, governing it and ruling it on behalf of God. Furthermore, the phrase forever and ever that occurs in verse 8a indicates that this rule is not something that is transitory, not something that is subject to change as the position of the angels are. The throne that the Son has been exalted to and appointed to will continue and have no end. The Son's reign will be an everlasting reign, which makes his position fixed, unlike the changeable or mutable way that the angels are in an office of servitude carrying out divine directives and commands. Some commentators will try to argue that, well, what is being contrasted here is the creatureliness of the angels with that of the eternality of the Son. But that's not what the author of Hebrews is focusing on or arguing for. Psalm 45, 6, and 7 has nothing to do with the Elohim or the Theos that is the king of Israel and then ultimately is being viewed here Christologically referring to the true king, Jesus, has nothing to do with creating. He's not a creator. The Davidic king was God's vicegerent, and he belonged to a dynasty that God had made special promises to, particularly David, concerning the enduring nature of that dominion. But Psalm 45 only found a partial fulfillment in the historic Davidic kings of Israel. Instead, the full realization of these promises of God would occur only in that prophesied son of David, who would appear, to whom all the promises that are associated with that dynasty will be embodied and fully realized. And now that that true son of David has come in Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God, he fulfills every ideal that was spoken of concerning the kings of Israel and the promises made to David. Therefore, to interpret the word theos as a vocative in no way suggests anything about the Son being God himself. It's not inherently part of the author of Hebrews' rhetoric or his strategy, and it cannot be derived from the meaning of Psalm 45, either in the historical context or in its reappropriation in Hebrews chapter 1 and in the catena of scriptures. So the Son's position and authority are everlasting, in contrast to the mutability and ephemerality of angels. And then secondly, the Son is anointed above or rather than his companions. He is given some status, he's given some honor that is distinct, unlike all others. It is above, or I think better way to take the preposition, rather than his companion. The Son has been given a unique anointing. It's either in degree or exclusivity that is not shared with any other. He is in a unique position. While the majority of scholars, they interpret the word theos as a vocative, they like to see its most literal sense in the passage, where the Son is the theos, the one who spoke the world into being. And they argue that this is the purpose for which the author quotes Psalm 45. And though they look at things sort of like in a myopic way, where they miss the forest for the trees because they focus on this one little question, there have been some scholars who note that, well, the actual meaning refers to the kingship. That's the reason why the author of Hebrews quotes Psalm 45, is it deals with Jesus reigning in God's kingdom rather than serving. And even though the majority of interpreters view the application of theos as implying deity for Christ in verse 8, George Buchanan of the Yale Anchor Bible Series is one of those exceptional voices of scholarship who dissents from that view and rightly claims the Christological significance of verse 8 with the use of theos as pointing toward the elevated status and preeminent position of the Son. What he says is, for the author of Hebrews, the Son was the firstborn, the apostle of God, the reflection of God's glory, and the stamp of his nature. But he was not God himself. So while seeing the word theos as vocative is probably the preferred way to understand the grammar in Hebrews 1:8, it doesn't provide any grounds for ascribing deity to the Son. The term theos can be applied legitimately, just like Elohim, to the king of Israel and to the judges of Israel. And the same can be said of the Son in Hebrews 1. The meaning of theos should be understood in relation to the significance of why Psalm 45 is quoted in the Katina in Hebrews 1, which is about the Son's exaltation and enthronement in kingship. Thank you very much.
At this time, there will be questions. So if you have questions, you want to come around, we'll make a line over here to the side, and then I'll hand you the microphone. You can ask a question, and Jerry will answer. And try to keep the questions focused on the question. In the form of a question. You can talk about other things later. But just go ahead and line up here. All right.
Thanks for your presentation. Is this on?
Yeah, you're on.
It is on?
You're
Okay, all right. I don't have any disagreements on anything in Psalm 45:6 or Hebrews 1:8. I think we agree on that. This is just actually a minor question, and I just figured since the line's short, I can ask this. You emphasize a couple of times in Hebrews 1:9 and Psalm 45:7 that your God has anointed you, and you kept saying rather than your companions, opposed to above your companions. Again, doesn't change anything, but the Hebrew preposition mean more suggests kind of like above, and then para with the accusative would be more kind of like an above. And especially in the context of the high exaltation, I'm wondering why that seemingly obvious sense is kind of being set aside for a rather. Again, doesn't change anything else, this is more of a question.
Yeah, because I think this depends on what you take to be the object of the metakoi, right? The companions, the people who are being compared, like who those are. If you'd say that it's humans, if those are the companions, then you could say that, well, Jesus has a higher position, is exalted above all human beings. I think, though, if it's angelic, if the reference is the angelic host and the companions are spiritual divine beings, which Jesus is being compared in the Katina, angels versus the Son, then I think that he has received the anointing rather than them. I don't know if it really does. I mean, it is a use of the preposition. It can mean more than, or can be beside or instead of. So I think it's probably just an interpretive choice on which way you think the logic best flows.
Just follow up on that real quick. That's okay. So if in Psalm 45 the companions are human companions to the king, okay, and if every other occurrence of companions in the book of Hebrews refers to human readers, in what sense would we suggest the angelic reading?
Oh, that's basically based upon the logic of the Katina. It's contrasting angels and the sun, and therefore within the... Yeah,
but
so
the quotation of Psalm 45 is not contrasting angels and the sun.
You take the proximal context to be superior to the remote context. So in the context of Hebrews...
Okay.
Do you understand?
Yeah.
Okay.
I understand.
Sorry, that was not meant to be denigrating in any way.
Hi, Jerry.
Hey.
I just wondered whether, when you mentioned the cantillation in the Psalms,
Yes.
whether that's, you mentioned an 11th century manuscript, whether that's universal, or whether that's that specific manuscript that's using that cantillation.
I mean, it's throughout the entire Codex. The Masoretes, they did this through the entire Hebrew Bible to divide it into different types of meters and separations.
Right. But have we got other manuscripts that has not got that cantillation in it?
Yeah, we do.
So it's dependent on...
But because what this helps us understand, and we can see it actually through various other Jewish writings, is that the Jews had a long-standing tradition of interpreting this passage in a vocative sense. And that's reflected in the way that the cantillation works in the Masoretic text.
Yeah,
the Masoretic text is represented in the Leningrad Codex.
I understand it was the norm, but I just wondered whether or not if another manuscript didn't have that cantillation.
Yeah, we have Hebrew manuscripts that don't have cantillations.
Yeah, so whether
Which the cantillation, just because it appears, indicates the way that the scribes thought. If it's not there, we don't have any indication. It's like if it's not there, we can't really say what they thought. But because they put it there, we do know what they thought. We at least knew what that the Masoretic tradition thought about that verse, and that's reflected, as I say, in various rabbis writing about it later.
So it was a later addition, the cantillation.
Yes.
So it wouldn't have existed. It would have been added as a.
Yeah. It was definitely added way later.
Right. Okay.
It was actually devised by the Masoretes, and they did it as a way to help them in their transcription process and in the way that the vocalization is supposed to be, viewed when reading Torah.
Thank you for your presentation. So Psalm 45 is part of the Elohistic Psalter, where Elohim is far more used than Yahweh. And even some psalms from Book 1 are copied and Yahweh is replaced with Elohim. So could it be that perhaps when it says, therefore God, your God, that the first God was Yahweh? This originally it would have said, therefore Yahweh, your God. But then because it was placed in the Elohistic Psalter, it was changed to God, your God. How could it be possible? And if that's possible, what would the implications be on your thesis?
I mean, it's a purely speculative question about how perhaps scribal, emendations could have worked. I have no idea. We have no evidence at all that such a replacement occurred. Hypothetically speaking, if it were true that it was replaced, I think that would solve the ambiguity question of how the multiple uses of Elohim, the multiple uses of, probably even in the New Testament, the multiple uses of theos would still remain. But at least in the Hebrew Bible, we'd be able to see the distinction and then be able to carry that, meaning or that referent from each into the way the quotation is used in Hebrews 1. But alas, we have nothing to go off of.
Yeah, thank you.
Sorry, my English is not the best. Hebrew starts with the comparison between the Son and the prophets. So God spoke with prophets in the old times. Now he speaks through the Son. So he has to argue why should we listen to the Son more than to the prophets now at the moment when God is speaking to the Son, through the Son. And then he argues that the Son is higher than the messengers. And as Mr. Smith, I think, said, why is it Psalm 45 about angel beings? I think it's more about humans. So I would use Psalm 45 to argue that the Son is higher than other humans.
Yes, that is my view as well.
Yes.
But,
And
Dr. Smith was asking, what's the argument for the alternative? And that's where I replied that it's within the context of the Katina, where the contrast is being made with the angels and how come the Son is superior. Therefore, if the companions are the angels and he has been anointed above them or rather than them, that additionally shows the distinction.
Yeah, in my opinion, no quotation in Hebrews is about angel beings. All verses, when I read them in the Old Testament, I didn't find any quotation that is actually about angel beings. And I understood it in a better way. I would suggest to understand it as messengers or mighty ones. He compares the prophets, the messengers, with the Son and explains that the Son is higher than the messengers. And because the messengers are servants, okay, and in chapter 3, he clearly stated Moses, the biggest messenger, is a servant of his house.
I'm sorry, I couldn't follow.
Okay.
What was the question?
Well-
I just didn't find it.
My question is, how can we be sure that the word angels means angel beings
Oh, and not human messengers?
and not human messengers? Because the bigger argument is the Son is more superior than the prophets, than Moses, okay? Because the messengers, I think the prophets, are servants to serve his house, but the Son is the Lord over his house as Son. So this is
Yeah.
the bigger argument here, in my understanding.
Yeah, I don't think in the Hebrew viewpoint, the question is whether or not the Messiah was above other humans or not. I don't think that is the actual question at hand.
This is in chapter 3, exactly the argument. He is more higher than Moses.
He is in the sense of his station in God's, over God's people, that he's not a servant in the house of God like Moses was.
Yes.
He's a son. That's showing him as his position within the kingdom of God, or you could say the administration of God's, how God administers his program. But for the word angels, angelos, to be whether it's human messengers or divine messengers, I mean, that's just the word angelos means a messenger. You're asking, why should it be preferred to be viewed in chapter 1 in the Katina? Why should it be viewed to be divine messengers rather than human messengers like the prophets? Yeah. So, I think let me see if I can't pull it on my computer here. I was going to pull up the text to, I think it fills out later on at the end of the chapter to kind of point toward the divine messengers as the way that the contrast is working.
114.
Yeah, so after the Katina. Yeah. Actually, the follow-up after the end of the Katina, verse 14, these angelos, are they not all ministering spirits sent out to serve for the sake of those who are to inherit salvation? Yeah, that's the verse I was fishing for.
Okay.
To me, it points toward the divine spiritual nature of those messengers rather than them being human messengers. So,
Come on up. I can hold it for you.
Hello, thanks for that. I thought it was really good. The one bit I wasn't so sure about is why you think angels are ephemeral. Do you mind unpacking that a bit?
yeah, ephemeral in the sense not that they are mortal, but in their service. There's this idea of like they may serve for a time in a certain command of God or a certain directive they're given to go and do a certain task. And that then, when done, that place that they're given, that sort of a task they're given, concludes, and therefore it ends. It's ephemeral. It's not like they're, angels don't, according to the way that I'm understanding it, angels don't have this permanent, unending sort of like task that they're given for all of eternity. They're given certain things by God to carry out his will. And so therefore, their service is ephemeral. It has a termination point of where they might be given a different task. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I guess I see passages where Jesus talks about them existing in the sort of kingdom age concept.
Okay, speak up, say it one more time.
Yeah, so I was thinking, I guess it felt to me you were pointing the contrast between a kind of throne that exists forever and a sort of temporary thing of an angel, where I can't see any concept in Scripture of where angels end.
No, it's not their life doesn't end. It's about service.
The role.
It's about their
Okay.
station within God's kingdom. And okay.
Yeah, I was wondering about what comes after verse 10. No, sorry. I was wondering about verse 10 and the reference to the Old Testament, because in the ESV it says, it says, "You, Lord, laid the foundation of the earth in the beginning," in verse 10. But in the Old Testament, it doesn't actually say Lord, as in Jesus, right? It just says, "You laid the foundation of the earth in the beginning," meaning God. And what was... sorry, I lost my train of thought. So I'm just wondering how you view verse 10 and the reference there, because I can't see anywhere in that reference, I think it's Psalm 102, that it's not possible that the Father or God is talking to the Son in that psalm. It's just impossible to squeeze that out of that psalm. So I was wondering what your thoughts were on that.
Well, if you want to know more fully my thoughts, I actually did the first UCA conference on that passage. Okay. So you can check it out on the UCA YouTube channel. But to sum it up really quickly, I go through both structurally and semantically and contextually. I think the Son is being addressed in verse 10 in some type of figurative way, mainly pointing out the reason why the author quotes not just Psalm 102:25. I think it doesn't just quote that one verse, because if his point was Jesus is the creator, then he wouldn't need to finish the remainder. But he quotes verses 10, 11, and 12 in Hebrews chapter 1. He quotes an extended quotation which ultimately ends with this idea of that the creation has a termination point. But he doesn't. And so that's ultimately the focus of why that quotation is made in the Katina of Hebrews chapter 1. So I view that somehow the author's reappropriating that text, which is a Yahweh text in Psalm 102, and using the concept that creation will be done away with, but the Son's rule and reign that he's being given will not. He will continue on. He has an everlasting life and an everlasting, essentially, kingship. But listen to the video, and if you want to dialogue about it, I'd be more than happy to be in communication.
I had a question. The authors who said the best way to understand that passage about having a God was in regard to the hypostatic union. Do they include an explanation for how the writer intended his readers to understand what he was saying?
I mean,
are they aware that is a problem?
I searched long and hard for anybody who actually went into sort of rationale. It's almost across the board, all the major commentaries, it's just almost just assumed that the author's purpose is to claim the deity of Jesus in Hebrews 1:8 and just explain it off as, well, he is God in like an ontological sense, and therefore he's the Son. He's God the Son. And then in verse 9, it's God the Father who's then doing, in a functional way, anointing him and giving him this honor and everything. And they almost just don't even engage. It's almost just assumed to be matter of fact. Linsky was the only one who I found actually went into kind of like, well, this is what you have to have in your mind in order to see this. Most of the commentaries just flat out state it. They just literally assert this is what the author is doing, and they don't go into any kind of like explanation. I really had trouble finding anybody who really engaged with it.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. All right, thanks everyone.